There's a simple way to know who someone really is, not by what they say, but by how they treat someone they believe has nothing to offer. Most people looked at me and saw an old retired man driving a broken Mercury. They had no idea I owned the company they worked for. And one family dinner would change all of their lives forever. You want to know the truth about people? Watch their eyes when they think you're nobody. Watch their hands when they think you can't help them. That's where the real story lives. Not in the handshakes, not in the smiles, but in the half second before someone decides you're worth their time. My name is Theodore Whitmore. Teddy, to the few people who still remember me from before. Before the money. Before the buildings with my name buried 3 layers deep in paperwork nobody reads. I'm 71 years old, and I live in a house with a leaking gutter I keep meaning to fix, and I drive a Mercury that coughs like an old man on a cold morning. The paint's gone dull. The seats are cracked. And I love that car more than anything I own, because it's the last thing that doesn't lie to me. Here's what nobody at that dinner table knew. Here's what I carried into that house like a stone in my coat pocket, heavy and quiet and waiting. I own Halverson Freight Solutions. Not invested in. Not own shares of. Own. Every brick, every truck, every signature that matters. 3,000 employees who've never seen my face because I made sure of it. Decades ago, I decided that money changes how people look at you, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering who actually liked me and who liked my bank account. So I disappeared into my own success. I built a wall of lawyers and shell companies and silent partnerships so thick that even my own son-in-law, sitting across from me at Thanksgiving, wine glass in his manicured hand, had no idea he was talking to his boss's boss's boss. My wife Eleanor passed 8 years ago. Cancer. Quiet and cruel the way it usually is. She was the only person who ever looked at me and saw the boy from the Ohio steel town before she saw the man with the empire. When she died, something in me went quiet too. All I had left was my daughter, Camille. Eleanor's eyes. Eleanor's stubborn laugh. I would have burned the whole company to the ground to keep one real smile on that girl's face. So when she brought home Preston Vance, I told myself I'd give him a chance. I told myself first impressions lie. They didn't. Preston had a way of shaking your hand like he was doing you a favor. A way of glancing at your shoes before he looked at your face. He talked about his Ivy League MBA the way other men talk about their children, like it was the thing he'd built with his own hands, instead of something his family's money had paid for. And from the very first dinner, I watched him look at me, the quiet old man in the cardigan, the one who used to work in shipping, I think, Camille would say, unsure herself of what her father actually did all day. I watched him look at me like I was furniture. Something you inherit. Something you tolerate. He didn't know I was the one who signed off on his promotion to CEO of Halverson 3 years ago. He didn't know I read every quarterly report with his name at the bottom. He thought he'd earned that title through brilliance and hustle. What he'd actually earned was my trust, and I was starting to wonder if I'd made a mistake. The disrespect built slowly the way rot builds in a foundation, invisible until the floor gives out. At a company gala I wasn't supposed to attend, but did, standing near the back in a rented tuxedo that didn't fit right, I heard him tell a table of executives that his father-in-law was a sweet old relic, harmless, doesn't know what decade it is. Laughter. Clinking glasses. Camille wasn't there to hear it. I was. At Sunday dinners he'd correct my grammar. Ask me, with a smirk tucked into the corner of his mouth, if I'd ever thought about updating that car. People might think you can't afford better. He said it like a joke. It wasn't a joke. It was a test to see if the old man would flinch. I didn't flinch. I smiled and I passed the potatoes, and I filed it all away in the part of my mind that never forgets anything. Then came the invitation that changed everything. The Vance family, Preston's parents, old money, the kind that likes to remind you it's old, were hosting a formal family dinner. Camille called me, nervous, hopeful. Dad, please come. And Dad, she hesitated. Maybe wear something nicer? Preston's family can be a little particular. I told her I would be there. And I told myself quietly that I would wear exactly what I wanted. The night of the dinner, I stood in front of my closet for a long moment, looking at the one good suit I owned, still wrapped in plastic from the dry cleaner. Then I reached past it. I pulled out my gray cardigan, the one with the loose button on the left cuff, the one Eleanor used to tease me for loving too much. I put it on like armor. Because I already knew. I already had a feeling deep in my gut, the kind you get before a storm rolls in, that tonight I was going to find out exactly who these people were. And once you know that kind of truth about someone, you can never unknow it. I drove the Mercury through the gates of the Vance estate, past the valet who looked at my car like it had wandered onto the property by accident, and I walked into that house with my hands steady and my heart doing something slow and careful, like a man counting his steps before a long fall. I had no idea, standing on that marble doorstep, just how far that fall was about to go, for all of us. The door opened before I even reached for the bell, and Preston's mother greeted me with a smile that never touched her eyes, the kind of smile you give a delivery man you're waiting to leave. "Theodore," she said, like the name itself was slightly distasteful in her mouth. Behind her, I could hear laughter, ice clinking in crystal, the low hum of people who had never once worried about money in their lives. Camille found me in the hallway and squeezed my arm, relief written all over her face. "You came," she whispered, like she'd been afraid I wouldn't. I kissed her forehead and told her I wouldn't have missed it for anything. That part at least was true. Dinner was a performance. Preston's father, Richard, held court at the head of the table, talking about golf memberships and a summer house in the Hamptons like he was reciting scripture. Preston sat beside Camille, glowing under his family's attention, occasionally sparing me a glance the way you'd glance at a stain on the tablecloth. Noted, mildly annoying, not worth mentioning out loud. They asked me questions they didn't want answered. "So Theodore, what did you do before you retired?" Richard asked, swirling his wine, already looking past me before I finished the sentence. "Logistics," I said. "Freight mostly." Preston snorted into his glass. "Dad, he means trucks. He used to drive them, I think." The table laughed, soft and cruel, the way people laugh when they think the joke's target is too dull to notice he's the punchline. I let them laugh. I ate my food. I watched. Then Richard leaned forward, and I felt the air in the room shift, the way it does right before lightning. "Theodore," he said, setting down his glass, "I wanted to talk to you about something important. Family business, really." He slid a folder across the table toward me like he was dealing a winning hand. "Camille's inheritance, the trust from her mother. We're expanding the Vance portfolio, and Preston and I think it would be wise to use it as collateral. Just temporarily, of course. Family should invest in family." I looked at that folder for a long moment. I looked at Camille, who was staring at her plate, uncomfortable, sensing something wrong but not yet knowing what. I looked at Preston, who wore the expression of a man who had already spent money that wasn't his. I picked up the folder. My hands were steady. "I'll think about it," I said quietly, and I watched something flicker behind Preston's eyes, irritation, maybe the first real look he'd given me all night, like he was seeing me for the first time and didn't like what he found. I drove home that night with the folder on the passenger seat, and I made one phone call before I even took off my cardigan. "Run a full audit," I told my head of internal compliance. "Everything. Every contract Preston Vance has touched since the day he sat in that chair." Took 11 days. What came back turned my blood to ice. Preston hadn't just been coasting on charm. He'd been siphoning contracts to a shell logistics company owned by his college roommate, quietly bleeding Halverson of nearly $4 million over 2 years, dressing it up in paperwork so tangled it would take a forensic accountant to unravel. He wasn't just arrogant. He was a thief, wearing my company like a costume, sleeping next to my daughter every night with a secret rotting in his chest. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Preston walked in expecting a routine quarterly review, straightening his tie, already rehearsing whatever charming nonsense he planned to feed the room. Instead, he found me sitting at the head of the table in my cardigan, folder in front of me, 12 board members flanking either side in total silence. I watched the color drain out of his face in real time. "Teddy," he said, and it came out smaller than he meant it to. What is this?" "This," I said, "is the company you've been running into the ground." "My company? I've owned Halverson Freight Solutions for 22 years, Preston. I approved your hire personally, and I have spent the last 2 weeks watching you steal from the people who trusted you, including me." The silence that followed had weight to it, like something physical pressing down on the room. I slid the audit across the table the same way Richard had once slid that folder to me. "You have 2 choices. You resign effective immediately, and return what you've taken, and this stays a private matter. Or I hand every page of this to the district attorney, and you can explain the shell company to a judge instead of a room full of people who already know the truth. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence was the last honest thing he ever gave me. Within the week, I moved Camille's inheritance into an irrevocable trust, one that no husband, no father-in-law, no smiling stranger in an expensive suit could ever touch again. It was the only thing I could do to protect the one piece of Eleanor still walking around in this world. I told Camille everything on a Sunday afternoon, sitting in my kitchen with the leaking gutter still dripping outside the window. I told her about the company, about the wall I'd built around myself, about why I'd let her believe her father was just a tired old man who used to drive trucks. She cried, not for the money, never for the money, but because she said she finally understood why I always seemed to be watching people so carefully, like I was waiting for something. You were protecting yourself, she said. No, I told her. I was protecting you. I just didn't know from what. Until I saw it clearly. We sat there a long time after that, saying nothing, the way you do with someone who finally sees all of you and stays anyway. Here's what I've learned in 71 years of being underestimated. The quietest people in the room are often the ones who could end it with a single sentence. Character doesn't announce itself at galas or shake your hand a little too hard. It shows up in how someone treats the man in the broken-down Mercury, the woman refilling water glasses, the person everyone else has already decided doesn't matter. Preston saw an old man in a cardigan and decided I was nothing. He never once considered that the reason I looked like nothing was exactly why I'd built everything. Never mistake quiet for weak. Never mistake simplicity for stupidity. And never ever assume you know a person's worth by the car they drive home in, because sometimes the man in the broken Mercury is the only one in the room who was never broken at all.